Who here hasn't heard of, anybody not heard of Flow prior to this? Or know what that is? No, okay. You guys have it, yeah, that's fine. So Microsoft Flow is a, oh wait, hold on a second here. Sorry. All right, so we're going to go through and talk about what is Flow, why, when, and how would you use it. So Flow is a cloud-based process automation solution that lives in Office 365. So it's part of the Office 365 stack. It is not part of SharePoint directly. It's part of Office 365. SharePoint is also part of Office 365. So it's just another service under the Office 365 suite. And depending when you purchase Office 365, if you have any of the E1 or E3 or E5 SKUs, which are the kind of typical business classes of Office 365 you get, you're going to have some level of Flow built right in. The idea is that it's going to allow us to, automate workflows across all of your apps. Including apps that are built into Office 365, but also lots and lots and lots of apps that you might be using outside of Office 365. So there's well over 100 different services that Flow can integrate with. And it does offer a lot of the standard workflow features. How many folks have actually worked with other workflow products of any sort? SharePoint Designer. Anybody else work with any workflow products? No? Are you guys familiar with like a workflow in terms of like a drag and drop designer where you can kind of design a workflow process in general? So it has those types of features, but it's all cloud-based, and it's built into Office 365. So a lot of the scenarios that it's used for right now are things like notifications of when something happens. So for example, if somebody adds an order into my Salesforce environment, maybe I want to know about that. Or maybe I want to use that data to trigger some documents to get provisioned in SharePoint to initiate a sales order process. Or maybe I want to, when I upload a document into SharePoint, I want to have that trigger a process where it creates a record in Salesforce or in Dynamics CRM or in a SQL database or an Oracle database, or any one of a ton of different systems, which we'll see a bit more in just a moment. But it is a new product. It was just released into general availability the beginning of this year, or very late last year. So it's pretty new, but it's evolving at an amazing clip. Practically every time I log in, there's new services that were added in the prior week, and they're just extending it like crazy. Kind of same thing you talked about with Office 365, but maybe even more intensified. Rapid development of features just because it's so new. So these are the primary features that Flow offers. We've got things that are called connectors. That's the functionality that allows us to connect to some external system, whether it's Gmail or Box or Dropbox or Salesforce or Dynamics CRM or SharePoint or Outlook email, whether it's your personal Outlook.com or your Office 365 email. You'll see there's a ton of them. And triggers are things that initiate a workflow. So that could be an example of I uploaded a document to SharePoint, or I added an item into a SharePoint list, or I put a file into Google Drive or Box or Dropbox, or I added a record into Salesforce. Any of these different things can trigger a flow to get started. And we'll talk a little more about all of these things. I'm not going to dwell on this slide. So after I get through a little bit of the slides, I'm going to go through and show a demo that takes into account a lot of these different features into a single demo. One of the features we have are what's called a scope. This is just a way of grouping actions from a flow together. This is a list of all the different connections we have. Again, this slide is probably a few months old, so it might be like twice as big now. But each of these are the different services that you can integrate with. So I don't know, is that readable to everybody? Can you read the names on there? So I don't know if any of those names some of these are things I've never even heard of before, like pager duty. I don't even know what that is, but it's in there. But there's a lot of the really common ones: Dropbox, Google, Project Online. Basecamp. Okay, great. So some of these are built into Office 365, but most of these are actually external, which is pretty neat. We talked about triggers. These are examples of different triggers, but there's, again, probably a couple hundred different triggers out there that we can integrate with. Social media is another common one. If you want to, one of the most common demos we'll see is, hey, we're going to monitor a hashtag in Twitter. And whenever a message is posted to Twitter that has that hashtag, we'll capture that and then we'll log it in a SharePoint list or put it into a spreadsheet or things like that. That's a really common example. There's option for recurrence, which means we can schedule it. Hey, just start this workflow every morning at 9 o'clock or every 24 hours or something like that. And there's even a flow app on your phone where you can put a button on your phone that you can just press and you can type in some data and that will trigger a flow. So a lot of different ways to initiate our flows. Here's an example where I'm connecting to Salesforce, and I can select when an object is created or when an object is modified. I can then select the environment of Salesforce. Maybe I have a production Salesforce and a test one, so I can connect to either one of those. I can then browse the list of objects that Salesforce offers. Right? Salesforce has a couple hundred different tables that they store data in. In this case, it looks like I'm selecting the opportunity. And then every time an opportunity is either created or modified, it'll fire off my flow and do whatever I want it to do. Specific to SharePoint, there's 4 triggers. Basically, when a file is created or modified, and then when a list item is created or modified. So those are the only 4 ways that we can initiate a flow out of SharePoint at the moment. And I will admit that for all the integration with other things that Flow does, the integration with SharePoint is good, but it's far from great yet. I mean, I think it's going to get there, but there's a lot of things that we can do in other workflow products today, like Intex, that you've heard me talk about, that we can't do in Flow today. So, but it's improving really fast. So I expect that in the near future they'll have a lot of that. After we create a trigger, we can then add actions or steps to our flow. And there's different types of steps: actions, conditions, switches, apply to each, do until, and then a scope. So an action is a set amount of functionality, right? You basically select that action, and then you can enter configuration settings, and it's going to do something like I'm going to send an email message with a notification, or I'm going to add a record into Dynamic CRM, or I'm going to save a file into Google Drive or SharePoint or something like that. Condition is really where we want to just have an if this or that, right? So it's going to evaluate some condition. If the condition is true, it'll take one path. If the condition is false, it'll take a different path. And we can then have additional steps under the true or the false path. So depending on which way it goes, our workflow does different things. So you can see different examples of actions here. This action is building a string of text. We can concatenate variables from our trigger or from other actions to create a message. And you'll see some examples of that. In this case, I'm going to query Salesforce. I'm going to query the accounts object using the account ID. So when an object was modified, I'm using this account ID, which came from the trigger, to look up an account, because I modified an opportunity, and that opportunity is linked to an account. So now I want to query the account to get more details about that account. In that particular case, we were using a trigger in Salesforce, but the trigger can be in any number of systems. That was just an example that I used. How many folks here have actually used Salesforce in their companies? Gotcha. There you go. So this is a way that, Office 365, this is probably the easiest way that you can integrate Office 365 with Salesforce by, either pushing data into Salesforce, editing data in Salesforce, or responding when things happen in Salesforce, and you want something that now happen in Office 365. Earlier, we looked at the triggers that are related to SharePoint. In addition to those triggers, there's these actions that are available in SharePoint as well. Things like creating a file, creating a list item, listing the files that are in a folder, or copying a file, deleting a file, or deleting a list item, updating a file or updating an item. It looks like a pretty healthy list, and it is, but there's a lot of things like having used products like Nintex, where you can do almost anything you can imagine. There are things that, to me, are very simple that you can't do yet. Like, this isn't complete enough to satisfy every scenario that you're going to want to do. In fact, it doesn't satisfy a lot of the more common scenarios, to be honest. So I'm waiting for this to evolve. I know they did just announce yesterday one enhancement. It used to be, I can't remember what it was. I think it was when you're calling get item, you can only filter it by like the ID of the item. And if you wanted to filter by like, some metadata that item had, there was no way to do that. I think they just announced that feature yesterday. I haven't tested it yet though. So, here's the condition. We talked about that, where I can specify a value, choose a comparison, and then specify another value. And if it's equal to or greater than or less than, it'll evaluate to either true or false. And then we have more actions that will go into the branches. So, I'm going to say if it's a state, which is a property from another action, and I'm going to compare it to the state of California. If it's California, it'll go to the true path, and otherwise it'll go false. So, you can see more examples here. So, one of the things I think it does a really nice job of is this apply to each, which is where it's going to iterate through an array of objects. So one of the actions, for example, for SharePoint is called list folder, which means I can specify a folder in the document library, and it'll enumerate all the files that are in that folder. And if I add that there, and then I add another action below it, it automatically knows that the prior action returns an array of objects. So it's going to wrap my action inside of the apply to each automatically. I didn't even have to really do that. It just, I put in this get file content, but it automatically wraps get file content in this apply to each for me. And so what that means is that it'll use this get file content automatically on every file that gets returned by the list folder. So I thought that was a pretty cool implementation. And I'll actually show an example of where we're using this in an actual demo here in just a few minutes. Any questions so far, by the way? If there are questions, just shout them out. I forgot to mention that. This do until, a little bit more limited, but it's a way to have a workflow repeat until some value changes. The use cases for this are kind of limited to when you're using something called the common data model, which I'm not going to really get into. So this one's probably not as useful for the majority of scenarios. Against multiple files? Yeah, it's actually a great question. It's very timely because this slide here talks about templates. So what you can do is take a flow and save it as a template that you could reuse. So if you have a flow that works with a certain set of data, maybe, and you've got a list that has those columns, then maybe you have that same list in dozens and dozens of sites. You could potentially just use that template and replicate that flow to each of them. So, but the reuse story is, again, I know where you're getting at because we've discussed some of the, I'm assuming you're talking about some of the projects that we've talked about with Ron previously with your workflows. Yeah. So I kind of know where you're heading, and that's why, flow is not the right solution for that particular project. Because you'd have to manually recreate I mean, you can use a template, but you still have to design that. You still have to implement it each time, as opposed to having something that you can just push out and deploy to everything. It's not. It doesn't have the reusability that like that does. Correct. Not yet anyway.
Also, it runs under the user's credentials. So if you compare, for example, to SharePoint Designer, it's not working the same.
Correct. That is true. And there is a notion of my flows and then my shared flows that are shared. But most flows are running under that user's context. Correct.
Because so when you do my shared flows, what happens? Does each user authenticate?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what you're describing. There's a lot of scenarios, right? If we're talking about a flow that's connected to a library and user XYZ added a file to that library, I'm not even sure exactly whose security context it's running under. I'm not sure. That's a good question.
I was actually wondering how secure this is. Because you create a flow and then you share it with somebody else.
Well,
you already entered the credentials.
Yeah, I don't know that you're doing that, right? If I create a flow on a library and you have permission to upload a file to that library, you probably are not even aware that my flow is running. It's not like you're going to get access to my flow. But the flow will process and do whatever it's designed to do when you upload a file.
Yeah, yes. This is what you run.
No, but if I write the flow and you go to the library and upload a document, I'm not sharing my flow with you. But let's say my flow sends an email to somebody. Maybe I want to get a notification every time anybody uploads a file to that library. You know, when you upload a document, I'll get an email. You might not even be aware that the flow ran or that I got an email.
I thought you were talking about share.
Well, I think that would be the case in either scenario. Meaning,
would the email come from you?
And keep in mind, a lot of times flows are not initiated from content in SharePoint. It could be initiated by something in Salesforce or.
Yeah, but Salesforce is the same. When you create a flow, you still have to enter your credentials.
Correct, but if I create a flow that uses Salesforce as a trigger, and let's say that trigger is every time an opportunity is created in Salesforce. If you log into Salesforce and create an opportunity, it'll trigger the flow, and you might not even be a user in Office 365.
Yeah, I think if you send an email, it's going to send it to your.
It'll send it under my name because I'm the author of the flow.
If you upload something to SharePoint, you can upload it under your.
In case of SharePoint Designer, deploys the workflows I built. It sends when I send notification emails like when all this guy is updated, it sends it with the site name.
Yeah, I mean, the flow is really connected. I mean, keep in mind, flows might not have anything to do with SharePoint at all, right? So the security really isn't related to what's happening in SharePoint because most flows don't even touch SharePoint. It's related to me. That is correct. And flows will have connections, right? When I create a connection, I'm going to enter some credentials to my Salesforce tenant or my Dynamics GP or my Google Drive. And so when that flow runs, it's using that context defined in that connection, regardless of who else is connecting to Google or Dynamics.
So I was asking you to share. You start sharing.
Well, so in other words, let me catch up to that. I'm going to show you, because I think we're talking about something different. What we're talking about right here are just templates. And these templates are provided by Microsoft, right? And by the user community. So if somebody creates a flow that is very reusable, you can submit it as a template and then Microsoft might include it here. Or you can create templates, I believe, that you can just reuse internally, for yourself. But these are just starting points. So if you're not sure how to get started, or you find something that looks similar to what you want to do, you can just select from a lot of, there's dozens and hundreds of templates, I believe. I haven't actually worked with the templates too much because it's pretty darn easy to just get started from scratch. And I mean, the template might save you a half hour of time or 20 minutes or 15 minutes. But they are there as a great starting point. Now, there's also a mobile application, as I mentioned. And the mobile app does a number of things. Number one, it's available for your iPhones or Android. And it basically has these general features. One is an activity summary, just sort of showing what flows have run recently and whether they succeeded or failed. So here I can look at a list of flows that have run recently. You can see each different flow and how often it ran. And then you can click on one and see a drill down of a particular instance. And the green check marks indicate that this particular step completed, or if it errored, it would show me where it errored out. So you can actually debug your flows right from your phone. You can actually create new flows from your phone as well and browse templates and actually author workflows on your phone. I haven't ever done that, but it is there. Here's an example of selecting a template. And then you can modify the flow. Now this feature I mentioned earlier is a button. You can create what's called a button flow, which is a button is a type of trigger. So I can create a button, a flow that uses the button trigger. It'll now show up on my phone. I can just press that button whenever I want. And I can also enter, I think it's just one value of text that will go with it. And then that text can be used in the flow. And then you can interpret that text and decide what you want the flow to do based on it. So some people use it like, hey, send an out of office reminder to my boss. Like, I'm working from home today. You know, click this, I press this button and it sends my boss an email that says I'm working from home today. That would be an example. So let's see here. Here we can see more, I can disable a flow from my phone, which is handy. I mean, one time I had created a flow that was monitoring Twitter and I forgot to turn it off. I did it for a demo. I forgot to turn it off. And it was monitoring the SharePoint hashtag or something, which is, you know, SharePoint hashtag happens thousands of times per hour probably on Twitter. So the list that I was populating with that flow was just getting bombarded. And I realized it, I'm like, oh no. And I was able to just on my phone turn that off because I didn't want to let that keep running. Pretty cool. Flow does have kind of limited administrative capabilities right now. One of the main things it does have is allow us to define different environments. So each flow user will have their own personal environment where you can create your personal flows. And then there's also a company environment that's shared. So I can create a flow there. And if you and I were in the same tenant, I can create a flow and you could edit that flow. And there's also this data loss prevention feature where we can define rules at the company level that says, you know, I don't want to allow Eric to create a flow that queries our SQL database and publishes it data from there into Facebook, right? That seems like something that IT might not be happy with. So we can define these actions and we can say, you know what? Actions like Facebook, Twitter, and any social media type thing, they're in the personal use area. And then we have other actions like SQL or Oracle or, you know, business critical applications. Those are grouped in a different area. And then there's other actions that are in the in-between area. So what that means is if I create an action that uses Twitter, I can use any of the personal actions or any of the in-between actions, but I can't use the business data actions. And if I create another flow that uses SQL action, I can't now drop in a Twitter action into that same flow. I can use the business only ones or the mixed ones, but I can't mix personal and business into the same flow. The last part here, I'm not going to really go into this. This is more if you wanted to create your own custom actions in Flow. For those of you that are developers, right? Harry, you're a developer. Carlos, Tino's a developer. Who else? You're a developer. So if you wanted to create custom actions, there is an API where you can expose, you know, create an API using what's called Swagger, which is based on the Open API standard. And then you can import that into Flow, and then your action will show up in Flow, and you can actually publish it to Microsoft and they can approve it, and then it'll be available to other users as well. Or you can just do it for your personal use. So I'm not going to really get into that one right now. So Flow is available for free to anybody that has an E1, an E3, or an E5 SKU. Those are the standard enterprise SKUs that most organizations would have. But then there are premium editions that you can purchase. Additionally, if you wanted to, if you're using it heavily, you might need to jump into one of the more premium editions. These are some of the things I found that it's kind of light on right now. For approvals, there is an approval task. Basically, what it'll do is send an email to somebody with two buttons, approve or reject, or you can configure what the buttons are, and that user can click approve or reject when they get the email. But it doesn't have things like escalation or delegation or reminder. So if I get an approval task, but I'm out sick or I'm out on vacation, I forget to do it, there's nothing that's going to like automatically kind of remind me or reassign it to somebody else to do it for me. That's an area where products like Nintex are a lot more sophisticated right now. From utility actions, lacking some of the things like date conversions or string parsing. If I get a message from somebody in text, like an email, and I want to interpret that text and maybe split it out and parse it into different variables, it doesn't have features for that yet. Or doing math operations or date conversions, stuff like that.
So Tom, I'm a little ignorant on that. You say it's the Nintex wheelhouse. Is that like basically a Nintex app that you use?
Well, I'm just saying that the Nintex workflow products that you can add into Office 365, these, it does all of these things really well. Where these are things that Flow is light on right now. So it's not really a Nintex app. It's just well, yeah, I think about it. I mean, it's an Nintex add-in, like a normal, not a mobile app, in other words. It's just part of the Nintex normal Office 365 app or SharePoint solution. Yeah.
So I'm a SharePoint, I'm using SharePoint 2010. So
Okay.
Workflows.
Correct.
Building into a list and all that. So this tool is going to replace the workflows in SharePoint?
Yes, but not in SharePoint 2010. So this is a solution for Office 365. So yeah, so if you were to, if you stay on SharePoint 2010, then you're not going to get Flow. You would have to, migrate to Office 365, and then you would have access to Flow.
Yeah, we're going to migrate.
Yeah.
But my question is like, this tool is going to
yes.
SharePoint workflows.
Yeah, so SharePoint Designer is still supported in Office 365.
I would say it's an option. You're not
Yeah.
required.
Correct.
Because we're in Office 365 and we're still using SharePoint.
It's still, in terms of capability, it's still very far.
Yeah.
So it's very basic. You get, it's not in the list, but for example, you can let it into a group.
Correct.
In this tool. So it's really three actions.
Well, you can do, there's a for each action, which does iterate, but you can't, so there is some looping capability, but, so there's a for each action.
Yeah, for each. It's,
but
not like go back to step 2.
correct. It doesn't have state machines, which I didn't mention here. Yeah. So, there's a lot of things that Flow does that SharePoint Designer doesn't do at all either. So it's not like one is better than the other. Right, SharePoint Designer has certain features. In fact, I think the next slide speaks to that a little bit better. I tried to do a comparison of Flow versus Nintex versus SharePoint Designer. And, Flow is really good at, number one, it's free for most Office 365 users. So is SharePoint Designer. In fact, SharePoint Designer is always free. Flow starts off at a free level, but then there's some premium subscriptions available if you want to use it extensively. For Nintex, it's not free at all. External triggers is something that Flow supports and Nintex supports. SharePoint Designer doesn't do that. Right? So all those external cloud services that you can integrate with in Flow, SharePoint Designer doesn't support that at all. Now you can in SharePoint Designer call a web service to you can call out from SharePoint to a web service, but there's no way to easily have Salesforce trigger your SharePoint Designer workflow without a lot of custom development. Things like a for each are supported by all of them. Do until is supported. They all have the ability to compose text, like a string builder where I can concatenate different variables into a single string. They all work with SharePoint Online. But I will say that right now, SharePoint Designer has more SharePoint integration than Flow does. Flow has lots of Office 365 integration, but specific to SharePoint, it's still lacking a lot of the common things that you can do in SharePoint Designer or in Nintex. They all support the ability to pause a workflow. They all have, well, SharePoint Designer doesn't really have templates, but Nintex and Flow have those. Flow does allow you to actually administer the system from your phone, which I thought was pretty neat. Well, I guess, yeah, you can create them, but it doesn't come with a whole bunch of templates. At least not that I'm aware of. Yeah, that's what I meant. So Flow itself doesn't support mobile forms, but there's a companion application called Power Apps, which is kind of the sister application for Flow that does allow you to create mobile forms. I'm not covering that in this section, but it's there. Again, Flow and Nintex support external connectors, as we talked about. But then here's all the areas where Flow kind of doesn't do, where Nintex handles those things really well. And actually, SharePoint Designer supports things like variables and parallel actions. And SharePoint Designer has a lot of utility functions for doing basic date calculations or string parsing or things like that, math operations. And SharePoint Designer can deal with document metadata better than Flow can. Flow is getting better at that, but it's still not so great. And Flow is really not a great modular reuse solution. SharePoint Designer can create a reusable site workflow that could be deployed to, attached to a content type and deployed to many sites. Although I know you guys have actually had issues getting that to work. But oh, really? Oh, interesting. All right. So there you have it. Anyway, that's kind of the high-level comparison. So with that in mind, let's actually do some demos. God, this is... There we go. All right. So this is, hey, are you still with us, by the way?
Yes, sir.
All right. Forgot you were there. Any questions from you?
No, it's awesome. Thank you.
All right. So this is the Flow page. You can get there by going to flow.microsoft.com, which is inside of Office 365. So it's got its own URL. And if you're in Office 365, let me see if I go to, say, so if I'm already in Office 365, I can also get to Flow by clicking on this is called our app launcher, for those of you that are not familiar. Also nicknamed as the waffle. And this is the main way to navigate across applications in Office 365. And you see that there's lots and lots of applications within Office 365. SharePoint is one of those. Flow is another one. So that's just another way of getting to the site. But if you want, you can just type flow.microsoft.com in your browser and you get to the same place.
So if you buy
If you buy additional add-on.
if you want to convert Microsoft products in there too, like you use Microsoft projects.
Yeah, like you have Project Online. it would show up in the waffle, right? As an example. But there's things like Sway, there's Delve, there's Power BI, there's Planner, there's email, calendar, and all lots of other things. Flow is one of those many different applications. So when you get to Flow, the first thing you'll have is My Flows, right, which is right here. And you can see I've created, quite a few different flows, and they're all under this My Flows. What I actually haven't had a chance to do yet is create something I've created any yet under the team flows. These would be flows that other users in my tenant could also work on with me. So I could build half of it and then turn it over and let Eric or whoever, finish it up for me. And you notice how there's options here to create one from blank, or there's an option to create one from a template. So we'll just go through and do a blank one to start. And so when I do that, the first thing I have to do is select a trigger. And so it kind of remembers the triggers that I've used most recently, and it's going to prompt me for those. But you can see there's actually 143 different triggers available right now. And I can sort of browse through the list. You can see there's quite a lot of them. And of course, I can narrow it down. If I wanted to do, you can see Twitter is right here, but let's say it wasn't, I could just start typing, and it'll filter the list for me. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So if you're on that slide, I remember there was the free version, and then there was the 2 paid versions at the end. Those are the premium ones, and I forget the pricing, but it's like an additional cost per user per month, and those would give you access to the premium ones. And so we can go through and look at which ones are premium. I know Salesforce is considered premium. GoToMeeting is premium. There's quite a few others, but it's probably like 10% of them are considered premium. Okay, that sounds right. I think the other one is 15 for the plan 2. Yeah. So I think the most common demo that people do with Flow is using Twitter. So what I'll do here is I'm going to quickly I'll use Twitter as my trigger, and all I have to do is specify the text in Twitter that I want to search. So I'm going to search for hashtag #SandSpug. And if those of you that are on your phones and can tweet real quick, not yet, but let me get it set up. But when I get it set up, we'll do that. So what I'm going to do right here is do hashtag #SandSpug, and then I'll add a new step. And you can see that under the add a step, I could choose an action, a condition, or more. And under more, we could do an apply to each, add a scope. A scope is just a way of grouping related actions together visually. You can collapse it, collapse a group of actions so it doesn't take up as much space on your screen. A switch is kind of like a condition, but it's got multiple branches. I'm just going to add an action though. And again, I can browse through. We have 222 actions, it looks like. Is this big enough for everybody to see, by the way? There. And I'll just type in SharePoint. And select SharePoint. Now I can browse the list of actions that are related to SharePoint. And we're going to just create an item. And let me get out here. Boy, this is really difficult because on my screen the text is minuscule. Yeah, I can zoom in on the browser, but it doesn't expand the address. Okay, so I've got a site that I've already created previously that I've used for a lot of my Flow demos, and you'll notice I have a list here called tweets, and it's got a lot of data in it from before. from other demos that I've done. And we'll just use the same list again right now. So let's see if I go back here. I'm going to, probably just zoom out on this one. Oh no, let's see. All right. It is well, it's in a site collection that's just called TMC, my initials, and then I've got like a flow test afterwards. So, you know what? Probably if you do here, copy it. So the first thing I have to do when I use any SharePoint action is specify the URL for the site, which is, that's my URL. And after I enter the URL, it'll now prompt me to enter a list name. But I don't have to type it out. It'll give me a list of all the lists in that particular site. So I'm going to just select my tweets list.
This happened to you that sometimes the list is not actually in the list, and you have to enter a custom value?
I've never had that happen. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know the UI, like back in the preview days last year, the UI was more flaky, and I definitely had issues where it didn't refresh right away. But I would say in the last couple months, I haven't seen that happen. And did it work if you typed in the custom value? Did that work?
Yeah.
All right.
That's weird.
So notice now that I selected this list, it now is aware of what columns that list has. Right. So now what I can do is map values from my trigger to populate those columns. So for example, if I click here on trigger, notice what happens is it displays the input parameters from my trigger. And so I think I'm going to select for the title, I'm just going to put the tweet text. All I have to do is click on that. And I could put multiple items, like I could put tweet text dash username if I wanted to. So I can combine values into a bigger value, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to come down to the tweeted by column, and I'm going to put in, tweeted by. Notice here, when I select RT count, that's a numeric column in SharePoint. So Flow is smart enough to go, that's a numeric column. I don't want you putting text values in there. And it's aware that the data types from the trigger, it knows that retweet count is also numeric, and it knows that this column is numeric. So instead of allowing me to select, tweet text, which wouldn't be compatible with that column, it prevents me from doing it. Put in description here. I think this tweet is just the original tweet. I think we'll duplicate that. And then there's location, which is, let's see. Yeah, there we go, location. I think there's, maybe there's, okay. All right. Okay. Well, I thought there might have been some additional parameters here for like a favorite count, but that's not available here. So anyway, you can see that what I'm doing is I'm taking the data from the trigger, connecting it to the right columns in my list, and at this point, we're probably ready to save this. So I'm going to give this a name. What is it? All right, I'm going to give this a name. We'll call this Capture Sandspug Tweets. Create a, and we'll click Create Flow. Okay, so this is now done. And if anybody that has Twitter on their phone, if you can just tweet something that says hashtag Sandspug in it. All right. And we'll come to our list here. It might take a few minutes. Now, this list, I believe, is sorted by descending order. Yeah. So if I refresh this, we'll hopefully see our recent tweets. Okay, not yet. Again, it does take a couple minutes sometimes to process. So while we're waiting on that, we'll just come back to here. I'm going to go back to manage my tweets. And if I wanted to edit that flow, I can click right here, and it'll just open it up in the editor again. But if I click on this information icon, it'll show me the actual runs of that flow. So. Oh, failed, all right. So apparently I made a mistake, so let's take a look at what happened. Expression. Oh. Okay, let's take a look at that. Maybe I. Oh, it's in a apply to each. I don't know how that. Okay. So let's move this out of there. I don't even know how that apply to each got in there. I might have clicked on that by mistake. But that was not supposed to be in a loop. So let's just delete this. I did not notice I created that. Yeah, that for each was not supposed to be there. So let's update this again. And if you guys could repeat that, at least a couple of you. Just resend the tweet. I notice here I can filter. I mean, right now we only have 2 executions of it, but we can look for ones where it just checked and nothing happened. Like here where it skipped because it didn't find any tweets yet. Or I can look for successful runs, none that are successful yet. We can just see failed runs, or we can just say, let's show me everything. All right. All right. Okay, so a couple succeeded, good. Let's go back over to here, and we'll refresh this. And here we go. Here's the tweets that we just captured in the last couple minutes here. So I can see the text, who it came from. This is Sal. There's his description of his user account. It captured his location, the date it happened. So that's a kind of, let's see, hello world equivalent for Flow. Every Flow demo I've seen starts off that way. Let's get into something a little bit more interesting now. So my favorite demo is one where it's actually a combination of a couple of things. It's this provision new customer, and it also integrates with this creating a new account in Salesforce, which is actually integrating with Nintex. So this, what happens here, and let me go back to my slide for a sec. So the idea here is I'm going to log into this Dynamic CRM. I'm going to enter a new account in Dynamic CRM. And all I'm going to do is I need to populate the name of the account, the ticker symbol, and the website. Those are the only attributes I really care about. That's going to trigger my flow. And the use case here is that when we add a new account, or maybe might be an opportunity for a salesperson in CRM, or this could be Salesforce or some other CRM type system, what I want to do is provision some content in SharePoint. Maybe we have a standard sales contract that we want our salesperson to use, and maybe there's a standard quote spreadsheet or something, and we want to make sure that our sales reps aren't just making that stuff up on the fly, that we're using a standardized template. So Flow is going to, everyone's going to send an email notification for approval. So I have to approve it. And then assuming I approve it, it's going to create a new folder in the SharePoint library. And it's going to iterate through a bunch of templates in a folder and make a copy of those and rename them in another folder for this new customer. And then it would send an email to the sales rep, you know, letting them know that their content is available. Actually, I don't think the email part is in the demo, but logically, you know, it might send an email to the sales rep saying, hey, here's the materials for your new account. Please edit these files, you know, using our templates. And then what it actually does is it adds another record into another list in that same site, and have a different flow that monitors that list. And this flow triggers when that list is populated. So the first flow is creating a list item that causes the second flow to trigger, and that flow actually calls into Nintex, and in Nintex we're saving that data into Salesforce. And that one was not, that was just more to show the interaction between a lot of different systems. It wasn't necessarily a real world use case. But that's how this demo works. So we'll what I'll do first is I'll just trigger it because it takes a couple minutes to process, and I'll step through how we actually created that flow. So I have Dynamic CRM open in one of these tabs. Here we go. Right. So I'm going to log into my Dynamics CRM. Okay. Anybody here using Dynamics CRM? I know a few of you are using Salesforce. Anybody uses Dynamics? You see Sal within your customers. You guys actually see a lot of Dynamics CRM.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Is that pretty similar to Salesforce then?
It is. It's the same type of product.
That's a lot of SharePoint stuff.
Right. I think it's a lot more. The sale. I'm not a. You know, I'm a former developer myself, but I was always a guy that did the back end development and the database stuff. I was never good at user interfaces. And I was looking at Salesforce like, it looks like something I would design, where Dynamics CRM looks like something like a professional UI designer would build. But Salesforce is more popular right now for whatever reason. All right, so go to sales, I'm going to go to my accounts. And okay, I'm going to add an account here. I have a company name I could use for my demo.
E+.
E+. All right. You know, I'm going to put you on our mailing list. This is a demo tenant. So I'm just going to enter three things: the account name, the website, eplus.com. All right. And the guy's publicly traded? Plus, all right. I think we can just make something up. So. What did I do here? Okay, and I'm just going to click save. So this is now going to trigger my flow that's called provision new customer. So while it's firing off in the background, let's jump back into flow, and we'll take a look at that one. So you can see, this is what that flow looks like. This one's a little bit more involved than the previous ones. We can see we have, it's a little slow to respond here. Okay, so that I just got an approval request. So one of the things that this flow does is send me an approval, which is, I only put that in there just to sort of show what the approval looks like. While I'm, okay. So we can see here I have this scope, and all that's doing is sending this approval email. And so if I go to my email, wow, you know what, let's do this in the browser because that is too small. Rich, can I zoom in on that? All right, yeah, I guess we can zoom in on this. So here's the email that Flo just sent me. And I haven't done a lot of formatting of this, it's just kind of very basic. I took the URL of the site that created by and a couple of the metadata values out of, actually what this is saying is it's going to provision a folder in my SharePoint site. And it's telling me the location of where it's going to do that. You see it gives me two buttons, approve and reject. So I'll approve that, and that will let the flow continue down its way. Well, let's take a look, because that's exactly what we're getting to right here. So here you can see we have the send approval email. And if I click on that, you can see how I configured the subject line. I just said approval request to provision, and then this is an attribute that came out of the trigger, right? So because I created an account in CRM, it passes all of the attributes of that account, and I can use whichever ones that we want. For the sake of this demo, I know I'm only populating the name, the ticker symbol on the website, so I wouldn't want to use anything else. But I could add other parameters in here. And then notice here I have user options, approve and reject. So those are the two buttons we get, right? I could add additional options by just adding them right here in a comma separated list. And then here's the body of the message. So you can see it doesn't give me a really great way to format, like a really nicely formatted, branded email. That would be kind of difficult to achieve with this. So in fact, I was having some issues getting it to wrap the text, and you can see I was kind of messing around with little HTML VR tags, which is like a line feed in HTML. So that part, like if you're trying to do like a really nicely formatted message, this is difficult to do that with right now. But I could, you know, specify the importance level of it. I could even add attachments if I wanted. But that's that. Now to your question, notice that underneath it I have a condition. And in here, the condition is going to compare the first value, which is the selected option. That is whatever of those choices the user clicked on, that's what's going to get passed over to my flow. And so now the condition is going to simply evaluate, and I can choose, okay, is it equal to, or does it contain, or greater than, less than. So I can choose a lot of different comparisons to do. In this case, it's just, I want to say, is it equal to approve? And if yes, it'll do this. Now, because I've zoomed out on this, it's stacking these things vertically. If I zoom out, it's a responsive design. So you see how normally it's displayed yes and no side by side, right? When I zoom out, it responds and it stacks it vertically. You can see here, if I just click no, nothing happens, and basically the flow ends at that point. If I click yes, notice how here I have basically everything else is comprised in this section, but this is what we call a scope, and it's collapsed right now, so it doesn't take up too much space. But if I click on it, it'll expand, and now I have quite a bit more functionality going on here. For starters, I have this list folder, and this is where we can, this is a SharePoint action that allows me to point at a folder in a library and iterate through whatever files are in that folder. So I'm pointing at this site, and this is the library and the folder that I want to look at. And if we look over here, I think it's that one. Notice I have this library here, documents, which is really our shared documents library. And notice I have a folder here called templates. right, which just has these 3 generic templates in it. So when I hit that flow, it's going to iterate through those 3 items in that template. And if I added a new template or I changed it, it'll just iterate through whatever's in there. And notice how now we have this apply to each, because list folder returns an array, so apply to each automatically comes next. And first thing we're going to do is get the body from the previous step. That's just the body of the file that we're iterating on. And we have this other action called get file content, and we can pass it the ID. So as it's iterating through each file, this is getting me the ID of that file. I'm using the ID of that file to get the content of that file. And then I'm using this other action called create new file. This action is actually called create new file, but I renamed it to be called create new file from template. So when you add an action, it gives you the generic name, like create new file, but then I can rename it by clicking here to make it more user-friendly to me, so I know exactly what this is referring to. And all I'm saying is create a new file, and I'm putting it into a different library, right? Instead of the shared documents library, I'm putting it into a library called client docs, and then I'm specifying a slash, and I'm using the account name to create a folder. And then I'm going to specify the file name, which is going to be the name of the account dash the original name of that file. And then I'm passing in the file content, and that will actually create a file. It's really just creating a copy of my template and putting it in there, but with a different name and in a different location. And then the last thing we're doing is simply using a create item action to take the account name, the ticker symbol on the website, and putting it into this other SharePoint list, which is right here called new accounts. And so this is just a normal SharePoint list. For those of you that are new to SharePoint, SharePoint supports document libraries, but it also supports just plain lists, which is rows of data, and you can define whatever columns you want to store. So think of it as like a web-based spreadsheet in a sense. But it's powerful that user 1 could be editing one row, another user could be editing a different row at the same time, and you can create custom forms on top of it and stuff like that. Initially, I created this list because I was building a different flow. Let me just go over here. I'm going to leave that open. I was testing another flow that was using that list as a trigger, and this flow had nothing to do with the first flow. And I just at the end I decided to kind of connect them. What I was doing here was a trigger that responded to that list when an item was created. And what I was really doing was I had created my own custom action using Nintex. And I just wanted a simple way to test that action. So I had wired that up to, I had wired up this flow to that list. And then I created this custom action in flow that connects to Nintex. And I was just populating the account name as the title, the ticker symbol of the website. And this is calling a Nintex workflow. And then in Nintex, that connects into Salesforce and it writes it into Salesforce. So there's 2 unrelated demos. And then at the last minute, I said, well, you know what? Why don't I just take the data from this one, save it into this same list so I could fire off the second flow automatically. And that's what's happened here. So at the end of that first flow, it should have created this item. It should have fired this off. And we can log into my Salesforce environment and verify that it all works. So let's jump back into our site. So if we go to client docs, we should see a new folder for E+, which is right here. So it just got created 8 minutes ago. And it has the files that were copied from my templates. And then if we look over here under new accounts, we should see E+ as well, which we do. There's a ticker symbol on the website. And then if we go to my Salesforce, we go to accounts, there's E+ at the top with the name, the ticker symbol, and the website. And so this got here again because we created that record in the account, the new account list. It triggered the flow, and the flow actually triggered through a web-based call to this Nintex workflow product, and that's where it created Salesforce. I'm not going to get into that part, but the point is just really to show how we can create. There's a couple of buzzwords that are out there. One is called workflow as a service. The idea is that instead of building these big monolithic workflows where we have a single workflow that does a bazillion things, you construct your workflows as small services, and you expose APIs, and you let workflow 1 talk to workflow 2 that can talk to workflow 2, and now you can create a very modular system that's really easy to reuse individual components. Or if I create everything in one workflow, and this little part in the middle is really reusable, but it's combined with all this other stuff, I can't actually reuse that stuff. So this is where we're showing how to create these services and exposing them as workflows. And then you can wire them up however you want to. So that's pretty much all I had, but I'm definitely open for questions or other things. So in this particular case, Nintex did, but Flow certainly could have done that. I just happened to have wanted to test calling a whole nother workflow system from Flow. Really, what I was really trying to do is just show how I could create a custom action in Flow. And I didn't really want to sit there and write the code, but because Nintex and Flow use the same open API standard, it's really easy for them to talk to each other. And so I just wrapped my Nintex workflow as an action inside of Flow. I don't know if we have enough time to cover that part of it, but it's definitely supported. But how many folks here do JavaScript or jQuery, JSON development? So, that's an open API, and the Swagger standard is targeted for you guys. So if you have systems that you want to expose as services, we can look at open API or Swagger, look it up, and it tells you how to define a Swagger file, and then you can import that into Flow to create your own custom actions, in addition to the hundreds and hundreds that it provides by Microsoft.
So that's the way you did it.
I did. The only difference is I didn't write my own code because I didn't have time, and because Nintex created the Swagger file that Flow needed, it was just a super easy way for me to kind of test out the ability to import my own actions. No, I mean, I think workflow as a service, Microsoft came up with that with .NET 4.0. They started combining WCF and Windows Workflow Foundation. And they basically said, if you want to build workflows, you now do it in WCF, right? And you can build a workflow, instead of building a WCF service, you can build it as a workflow and expose it through WCF, right? So that's a concept that's been around for a while. I don't know if Microsoft actually invented it, but they definitely popularized it back in the .NET 4.0 release days, which is, what was that, 2012 maybe? I'm not even sure. And so this is just an evolution of that. So that's everything I have for to present. But any questions, comments?
I guess you have the connection to
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure if that's in there. We can find out that it might be. I know there is some queuing stuff. I haven't played with it at all though yet. Let's take a look. If I want to create a new one, let's see if there's any triggers for it first. So there's Azure queues and Service Bus, but it doesn't show MSMQ. Let's go into, I go to add an action, so I can write a message to yeah, so Azure queues, but not MSMQ. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be in there. Let's see if we do. Yeah. Is there any special spelling for that? I haven't looked at that in a while. MQ, right? Yeah. So I searched by Q and MSMQ, and the only thing it showed was Azure queues. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I don't know if, I mean, it's been, I've worked with MSMQ years and years ago. I don't know if it's got the same kind of the specifications for, you know, working with things like OpenAPI to connect to it. So, that, you know, but that, it's probably something that's doable. It's just not as high priority. I mean, they're focusing on Azure and other cloud services as a priority. So that's why you see Azure queues in there. You might look at it as, is there, I bet you there's a way for using MSMQ to integrate it with Azure queues, maybe. And maybe that would be a way to do it. But, so.
Yes, one more question. One thing I was trying to do was display an Outlook calendar on SharePoint.
Okay.
On Office 365
Uh-huh.
SharePoint Online. And I was wondering if you had to try something like that. My issue is that when you create an event in Outlook, you can push it to SharePoint.
Right.
But then how do you synchronize?
So
if you modify, for example, if you modify an event.
So let's see. If I go, you're
Try that and,
talking about you want to use a calendar as a trigger, or you want to write to a calendar?
He wants to sync, so if you make.
I kind of want to sync one way.
You want to sync from the calendar.
From Outlook to SharePoint online.
So you want to be able to write an item to a calendar in SharePoint?
So I'm trying when I have the calendar in Outlook,
Mm-hmm.
and yes, I'm trying when an item is created or an item changes,
Mm-hmm.
then write it in SharePoint.
Gotcha. Okay.
I'm not able to. Well, I'm able to do the first step.
Let's see. So Google Calendar, Office, and it's in. What's the source of the calendar?
Outlook.
But what is Outlook connected to? Office 365 calendar?
Yeah, yes, still an Office.
Okay. So let's see if I select.
To start with, I couldn't find any way to display
Right.
an Outlook calendar in SharePoint.
Gotcha. So you're trying to just.
I was the initial the problem is how to display an Outlook calendar
Gotcha.
in SharePoint.
Gotcha. And when you say an Outlook calendar, you really mean an Office 365 calendar.
Yeah, it's an Office 365 Outlook.
Right. Right. Okay.
And display it in SharePoint Online.
So I know of an intranet solution called Powell 365 that takes a lot of Office 365 components. They're not inside of SharePoint itself, but it builds an intranet in SharePoint that allows you to surface all of those things without a lot of custom, really without any custom development. So it might work with the calendar. If it's really just a UI thing that you're trying to do, not really a synchronization.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're trying to do UI first and synchronization was your workaround.
I didn't find an easy way to do it, so I was hoping there would be an easy way.
Well, look at here. Like, so here we have Office 365 Outlook when an event is modified,
Yeah.
when an event is created.
Yeah, no, I tried that, so that's why I wanted to.
I haven't tried this, but it looks like we can have a trigger that says when an event is created
Yeah.
or modified.
So the issue is when the event is modified
Mhm.
in Outlook, you want to modify the item.
Right. It looks like this
You
is.
have to find it first.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's the thing. Is like if querying list data by with metadata is challenging in Flow. That's one of the things that
Yeah,
that's one of the updates that they just announced yesterday, and I haven't tried it yet. But now they've added filtering that you can use OData style query syntax to filter when you get items, where before you couldn't. So that might be supported as of yesterday. And I just got a note. So if you do, where did my mouse go?
The problem here is when you modify the item, the event, you want to find.
Right. So look, so if you go get item here, let's do. I think you might be able to do it now. Come on. All right, so here. Okay, so we do get item. So here, the get item takes a list name and then an ID. The question is, well, if you don't have the ID, how do you get the item? So,
Yeah.
so supposedly, there's supposed to be an advanced options. That's not there. So maybe it's not this section. Let me search. Hold on a second here. Let me find the email and see what it said. Wasn't it yesterday? God. Hold on. No, maybe it came to this one. No. It was an email that I got that was from a forum. Let me just go to the Flow forum. That way. Yeah, maybe that's something we can take offline as well. Yeah, but there was. I got to dig up that message. I barely even read the email. I just been busy with other things, but there was something about that supported. So I'll find it and I'll let you know the details. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks everybody for your time today. We will be meeting again next month. It's May 11th on a Thursday at this same location on the Office 365 security hardening with Anton, who's a Microsoft, I forgot his title, but one of Sal's buddies. So that's everything. Thanks. All right, Aaron, we're going to wrap it up here.
Hey, good work. Thank you, Tom. I appreciate it. Great work. Great demo.
Thank you. Catch you later.
Bye.